Welcome back, everyone, to the afternoon session. We have the second of our two panels, and then after that you're going to be doing some work. But before we start this panel, I just wanted to let you know that we are trending on Twitter in DC. Hashtag integrated dev is actually trending. And I just want to read some of the tweets to you. There's a lot of congratulations for FHI 360's work, the work Tricia just presented. A lot of people are finding that incredibly valuable. Something I came across to my surprise, this shows you the true joys of technology. There's someone in the room called Catherine Howe who has been preparing 7 pages of visual notes from the morning session. Catherine, please put your hand up. If you want to see these extraordinary notes, they're works of art, which I think FHI 360 is going to share with everyone. But if go on to Twitter and just take a look at the magic that Catherine has been preparing, unbeknownst to all of us, but now we all know. Thank you for sharing that. And the last one, I want to read from a young woman who is not in this room. And she makes a comment I think we all need to pay attention to. And she says that young international development professionals are very excited about integrated development, but need support from senior colleagues to have our ideas heard. And I'm wondering whether there's a lot of young professionals out there who she's speaking for, and I think we need to acknowledge that voice and hear it. And after all, this movement is going to be carried forth by young professionals just like her. Her name is Sydney Sapper. Sydney, if you're out there, we hear you. Okay, so for the second of our 2 panels today, we're talking about design and delivery, successes and failures. So this morning was evidence, now we're getting into design and delivery issues. And we have Janet Edmond to my right from Conservation International. Welcome, Janet. We have Aerie Changala from Nuru International on my far left. And we have Cara and Endyke Doran from FHI 360 in Mozambique. So Janet, I want to start with you. Let's start with the good news. Can you share with us a spectacular success story from Conservation International's long history of designing and delivering integrated programs?
Sure, definitely. Is my mic on? Can you all hear me? Great. So first I want to thank Tricia and FHI 360 for inviting the conservation perspective. I think we're one of the few conservation groups on the agenda today, so we're really pleased to be here. And we are excited to be talking about integration. To my old friend Natasha, who mentioned earlier there's no excitement, we are very excited. And I'm going to tell you why. And honestly, I will tell you, I got the integration bug more than 20 years ago when, as my first international professional overseas trip, I flew to Madagascar and I helped design the $3 million budgets for integrated conservation and development programs that U.S. Agency for International Development was experimenting with at the time. And I don't know whether it was the rich red soil, the green, the environment, or the zebu, which I'd never seen, but I really got excited about what World Wildlife Fund was doing, which was integrating family planning and delivering health interventions around a park in Andohala in the south. So I've been a convert ever since. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I've been doing at CI for about the past 12 years. So for those of you who don't know Conservation International, we're a biodiversity conservation and human well-being organization. So those 2 outcomes together are very significant for us. So you can clearly see that means that we deal with integration. And so I'm going to tell you a success story. It's a success story in progress, so it doesn't have real, written in highlights outcomes right now. But we have been very fortunate in South Africa to be working in the Eastern Cape area, in an area called the Nzimbubu. And it is a really very large, going from Lesotho down to the Indian Ocean watershed. It has one of the last undammed rivers in South Africa. And this area in particular is very water scarce. So CI has been working with a multitude of partners, including the municipal government there, to implement a really integrated program that looks at increasing water access, and also we're integrating in a water, sanitation, and hygiene aspect. So that's WASH. You know you're in DC when you get acronyms thrown at you. So what we're doing is trying to improve the freshwater conservation and WASH infrastructure and activities in that area. And just to say something about root causes, which is very much also an aspect of our work, there are incredible threats to overgrazing from livestock there, sedimentation in the water, which affects the water quality. And there's a really particular invasive species called wattle, which is everywhere, and it's sucking up the water. That's what it does. So in response, Conservation South Africa has been working really closely. There's a whole EU-funded platform called One Health, and we're working with the government officials, community organizations, men and women, livestock owners, really broad-based, trying to address these various threats. So we have a series of community agents who are out there pulling up the wattle, getting rid of the invasive species, which is returning water to the area, water recharge. We're also very fortunate to be funded by the U.S. Agency for International Development and the Africa Bureau, which supports something called Africa Biodiversity Collaborative Group. It's a group of 7 international conservation NGOs. CI is one of them. And ABCG has been particularly integrated because they do look back at the root causes of biodiversity loss. And there we're looking at a variety of social factors. So using some tools that we have produced under ABCG, these are programming guidelines for integrating freshwater and WASH. And what we're doing is using these, testing them in South Africa to bring together the development sector and the conservation sector for those mutually beneficial outcomes. And that's one of many reasons that I'm excited about what we're doing. It's still not quite all the outcomes are there yet, but we do also have a coalition of about 12 conservation and WASH NGOs who work internationally, saying we really need to work together better in this space, and we really need to do it on a variety of fronts: technical, financial, operational, and we need to promote the heck out of all these things. Because working together is the only way that we're going to ensure conservation outcomes happen with healthy, peaceful societies.
Great,
So.
Thank you. Aerie, I want to move from success to failure. Not that you're a failure. But can you share a story of how a spectacular failure inspired Nuru International's approach to integrated delivery?
Sure. Yeah, I'm not quite sure how I feel yet, being associated commonly with talking about failure. And I wouldn't necessarily say that failure led me to begin thinking about an integrated approach. Failure led me to begin to think about how we can design around how people live their lives, which then led to looking at integrated approaches. About 12 years ago, I was a Peace Corps volunteer in northern Burkina Faso. I was in a village right at the edge of the Sahel Desert. I was there to train on accounting, and going to be training a savings club. Week 1, locusts wiped out the village. And so all the food is gone. And accounting becomes a pretty silly enterprise at that point. It was tragically simple to do the accounting, but on the other front, it was, well, that project is completely gone now. So what do I do? Even before the locusts had come, people believed that the drought would have led to a crop failure anyway. But this just furthered it one step more. And so I scrambled, tried to figure out how am I going to, ensure food security? How am I going to meet with, donors to get food aid, humanitarian aid? How am I going to, scramble to make things keep moving along? And that's when I started seeing the interconnectedness of poverty. It wasn't just on one front. It started with crop failure, but then the drought led to, okay, well, now there's no pastures for the largely pastoralist community. And so farmers or pastoralists were faced with either, do I search literally, for greener pastures and then possibly encounter conflict as you move into agrarian societies? Do I stay and hope it's going to rain? Do I don't know. And as we started trying to figure out what are we going to do with this, how are we going to solve this, kind of putting on problem-solving mode, it just kept coming. Then, animal prices dropped, food prices soared. So then people who could normally trade a cow and have months of food, now it's a week of food. And so you start seeing this spiral, and you almost get caught in paralysis of just you overcome by events. And so just trying to move forward. Then health, typhoid would come through, further pulls you down. And I remember stepping back and trying to say, well, if this would just stop for a minute, I think we can get a big picture and plan it out. If it would just stop, just give me 5 minutes and we can, but it was just relentless. It was like you're drowning. And I think at that point, that's when I first started to begin to get a glimpse about what extreme poverty meant. And it's really easy to come with a targeted solution of, I'm going to teach accounting to a savings club, and I'm going to make unlock prosperity. But then, when things go wrong, what do you do? And so now at my time at Nuru, I've really spent a lot of it not trying to plan for a golden harvest that it's going to pay all the bills, it's going to sort everything out. It's planning around, what happens when everything goes wrong? How do you cope with shocks? How would you build resilience? And so that's really framed a lot of the approach now that I've taken into Nuru.
Great, thank you. And I want to come to you, Cara, because we had a question this morning on the management of integration. I'm not sure if she's still in the room, but it was a great question about how do you manage all the different players who need to work together to actually integrate program design and delivery. You have experience of this at FHI 360 in Mozambique, so tell us your story.
Thanks, Leith. And thanks to everyone for having me here at this ID Summit. Yeah, I'm coming from Mozambique. I work with FHI 360, and we are currently implementing 6 USAID funded projects. They're mostly health-focused programs, but the scopes of work for those programs really span across both community and clinical services. We're working with key populations, we're working with orphans and vulnerable children, we're working with adolescent girls and young women, we're working with youth. We're also working with the general population in areas of HIV and AIDS, in livelihoods. So really we are spanning across the continuum of care. And as a team, we sat back one time, and someone had said in one of the previous panels when we were talking about integration, why are we doing this and what do we hope to achieve? We sat down as a group of project directors in the country office and said, well, wait a minute, our scopes of work, where my scope of work for my project ends, actually the scope of work of your project begins. And how do we link across those programs to really meet the needs of our communities, meet the needs of the people that we're serving? And how do we do this? How do we really try to take all this technical knowledge that we're talking about and put together some systems and some structures in place so that we can integrate? We have USAID funding contracts, we have cooperative agreements that do limit a little bit what we can and can't do. So how do we put something in place to facilitate this integration? So we've come up with different answers to that. We have our own little small, we call it Search for Synergies working group, where we have focal points on each of the different projects so that we can, as a country office, we wanted to facilitate this. We wanted to find a way to ensure that if you have a child, an OVC, who actually needs to be enrolled in the HIV and AIDS program, there's a formal mechanism that we can actually do this. And we also want to work with the donors and work with the ministry to say, hey, how do we get the most out of our programs? How do we leverage each other so that we can meet the needs of the populations that we're serving? So we've established the different matrices, I'd like to call it, we call it a matrices in Portuguese. I'm trying to think of what the word would be in English, but we have developed a table. It's almost like a mini work plan where we've sat as each project one by one and really decided to say, okay, this is what I can do, and this is what I can offer this second project, and this is what I can expect from this other project. So we can clearly define and prioritize how we can work together and how we can facilitate this linkage across the different programs. Also, as a group, we've done a more formal mapping of where we're working and how we're working and what are our key areas so that we know in the different communities where we're working who's doing what and where. And from this mapping, we also identified different CBOs, community-based organizations that we're working with, and we were recently awarded another large HIV and AIDS project, and we said, okay, in a lot of the communities where we're working, we already have a community care program where we will be working with this HIV and AIDS program. We already have a community care program. So we decided to say, well, let's use the same community-based organizations, for example. We'll issue another subaward. They'll work together to kind of keep all of this under one roof, under one house. Because there's a lot of integration that really happens naturally in these communities. People know, people are working together, they understand what's going on. So, but how can we facilitate that through FHI 360 and through the projects that we were working with? So this is just one example of issuing, having one CBO, community-based organization, with several projects, 2 projects, for example. And of course, that does carry some challenges as well, because then you have one small partner who's has to now manage 2 financial reports every month. Now they have 2 sets of narrative reports, or they have, they have lots of other things that they have to report on based on having more than one grant. But at the same time, we can identify those key people within the communities that can help pass this link across different projects. If the community care program, for example, works with community health volunteers, and the clinical program is working with case managers in the health facility, and they're under one roof and they're under one, community-based organization, they'll know each other, and they can facilitate that transfer a little bit quicker between one project to the other. So this was one of the strategies that we used to try to think about how we manage all of this. What kind of systems can we put in place to facilitate integration across different projects? And again, having a focal point for each of the projects, and we try to meet regularly. We have this matrix that we follow and trying to keep on track, understanding what we can expect from one another and what we can offer one another. With the siloed programs, and we've heard that a lot here, you have an HIV program, you have a TB program, but I think it's okay to recognize that I may work on the TB program because I'm an expert in TB. I may work on the OVC program because I'm an expert in OVC care. But I can only do so much for my TB patient. But hey, if I can work with you and you can support the OVC side of my patient, then that's where the link is. And that's what we've been really trying to facilitate in Mozambique.
Great. What did you call it? Search for synergy?
Search for synergy.
That's nice.
We've been working.
Very nice. I want to come back to you, Janet, and something we've heard repeatedly is that the root of the problem here with siloed programs lies with donors, with funders, and that so much of the funding for global development is tightly siloed within a specific disease in health or even a specific intervention. Tell me how you've managed over all these years to fund these integrated programs. Do you have very understanding donors, or are you a very creative implementing agency?
A little of both, maybe? Well, just the caveat with me is that pretty much my whole career I've worked on USAID-funded projects. And I do think it is too easy to say, oh, it's just the donor's fault, because USAID has done an incredible job in doing integrated programming. I think with kind of the years, as the years go by, it kind of ebbs and flows. And definitely, Jason mentioned earlier population health environment projects. So CI was one of the 3 leading organizations doing that back in the early 2000s. And we really were able to implement integrated programming using family planning funds in these really remote areas like of Madagascar and the Philippines. And the uptake there was pretty easy, quite frankly, because I don't know what it is about island nations, but people just see integration and they somehow get it easier. But I have to say, from the funding perspective, we did hit certain walls with, well, you can't spend family planning money on this, and you can't spend environment money on this. But I think it really depends on working with who those donor managers are, and really being able to set up frameworks that are synergistic and that bring in other funds as well to complement the USAID funds.
But how much of your success story was down to certain individuals having a commitment to this and they were just very well placed in the right organisations?
Well, that is true. We would call them PHE champions, and I think at one point we had a list of about 50 of them within the agency, and now I'd say about a third of them have retired, unfortunately. Which is a little bit concerning. I know those people still are consulting for USAID, so that thinking is still there. But I do think there is within the agency more of a framework for integration. The Bridge project, which is USAID funded coming out of the Biodiversity Office, is tasked with integrating biodiversity into the agency's core business. So into the health office, into the food security office, into democracy and governance. And there are many people in the room who are working on that right now. So there is, I think, a renewed call for integration, and it does depend on those champions, definitely. And I've heard the administrator say very positive things about integration, so that's good for the next couple months, and then we'll see what happens after that.
Well, we need a new pipeline of integrators, and we're hoping one of the outcomes of today is that some of you are transformed and return to your workplaces and do things very differently. But Aerie, something Janet said struck me, that island nations, small populations, find it easier to integrate, they just get it. Now, you're the smallest and youngest of the organisations represented on the panel today, and you also have integration right through the DNA of Nuru. Is it easier to integrate if you're small?
Being a small person, I guess also being the island of Nuru, USAID funding is very foreign to us. We've had one small, I think $50,000 grant 6 years ago. And after that, we decided it's a bit too much paperwork. And so, and that was really our approach. And now as we're growing, I think it's a little bit similar to some of the stories Ben was saying earlier about small organizations, startups, looking for different means of funding. And it wasn't until I interacted a lot more in this environment that I realized that funding isn't generally unrestricted. And that was very foreign to us too. And I'm sure people are a little bit envious right now, but I think despite that, and despite starting as, when we started Nuru, it was going to be an integrated model. Despite all those factors, I don't think you can blame it on donors because we would still have silos. And it was just people from certain industries would stay in their little bucket, and we had to really work hard to try and break down those silos. And I think it doesn't matter how big or small of an organization you are, you're always wrestling with that tension between scale and innovation. You're always coming out with, oh, I'm breaking down the walls even more, it's becoming more and more integrated. I've got this new initiative I want to start, but now trying to implement it across geographies becomes the challenge, or whether it's worth it or not. And because you also don't want to always be, every day it's a new thing, because then our M&E team, or like Tricia needs to work to try and prove these types of things, and if the program teams are always changing everything. And Nuru's M&E team used to yell at us a lot about that. But it's always that challenge between innovation and scale. And so I think, for Nuru as a small organization or for FHI 360 as a large organization, it's the same challenge.
Cara, I want to finish with a question for you, then we're going to open it up. And it's just moving on to this theme of maybe integration is easier or works better in some circumstances. And you work with some extremely vulnerable populations. And it's always been a question of mine is, does integration disproportionately benefit the most vulnerable? Is there something about integration that it's able to specifically target these groups of people, often women and children, who really find it hard to benefit from mainstream services? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think as FHI 360 in Mozambique, we've been really trying to look at the people that we serve, the populations that we serve, and we're putting them in the center, right? Put them in the center, and regardless of what project they start working with, there's the needs of the communities or the people, the population, the patient, whoever we're working with, are vast. And if we can find ways to have these more elaborate referral networks or ensuring that we're linking across the programs, I think we can meet the needs of the population, even beyond what the the scope of work of that first project is. And I can think of a few examples that we have been able to achieve in Mozambique with this. We have the Youth Power Action Program that Mosh spoke about this morning, where there was a child-headed household who was able to, through these different referral networks, be enrolled in school. She had access to shelter and lots of, meet other needs that she had. Also with the Youth Power Action Program, there was, using the same CBO model that I talked about earlier, there's sometimes, I can think of in particular, we linked with the Programa para o Futuro, which is the workforce development project, and also the Youth Power Action Project, which does more OVC care, that we had the same CBO working for both of those programs. And what we found was some of the youth that were enrolled through the Youth Power Action Program were then passed to the PPF program. So they were getting more additional skills, maybe skills that they wouldn't have otherwise got, more workforce-ready skills. We also had some situations where we've linked the community care program and our HIV program, where we had patients who had defaulted on their HIV meds, and because we had this network of community health volunteers that were in the communities, we developed lists and passed some of those names of patients who had defaulted to the community health workers in the community program and brought them back to care. And of the patients that we were able to locate, over 80% of them were actually returned into care. So there are some really significant results that are coming out of the integration that we have between the different programs.
That's great. That makes sense to me, that when you have an integrated network, if you like, of services, it's harder for people to slip through. If someone drops the ball here, it's likely to be picked up somewhere else in the network. Maybe we haven't measured those full benefits yet, Tricia. Okay, now it's your turn. We have a good amount of time for questions, comments, reactions, anything you disagree with strongly. Please feel free to share those thoughts. I would just ask that you state your name and the organisation you represent before you ask your question. Who will go first? This is design and delivery. Yes?
I have a really loud voice, so. My name is Lisa McGregor-Gargani. I'm with USAID in the Democracy, Rights, and Governance Center, and we have a whole team dedicated to integrating democracy, rights, and governance into other sectors. And along with our colleagues from E3, we're working very hard at that. So I know some of you were probably at our event where we rolled out some case studies. So we have the beginnings of some evidence ourselves and how that's working. And I was curious about Mozambique when you had this synergy group. What was the reaction from the mission, from the funders about this group? Did they participate? Were they supportive? Were they able to help you move this agenda forward? Or just very curious of the reaction, and perhaps from conservation as well.
So luckily, USAID has been very, very supportive of this initiative that we're doing in country. And without their support and backing, I don't think that we would be able to do as much as we had. When you have the donor coming behind you and saying, "Why, FHI, you have all of these programs, why aren't you working together?" And then on the other side, we're saying, let's synergize, let's work together. It makes it really easy when it comes from the top. And also the leadership from FHI here, they sent someone from, like, hearing about our little working group that we had, we received support from the ID team in Washington, and that also sends a message that this is very important to all the staff and really helps push the agenda along. So yeah, thankful to the mission for all their support to help to get this through.
Did you want to respond to that as well?
Yeah, and maybe just picking up on the last point about vulnerable populations. So CI, I think it was back about 2004, was one of many of these international bingos, big international conservation NGOs. Definitely came under scrutiny because of the way that they were treating people. You had the stories about moving people out of protected areas and that kind of thing. And so in response, the CEOs of all of the major NGOs, World Wildlife, TNC, CI, they created this thing called Conservation Initiative on Human Rights, which really did a deep internal dive at each organization to see what our practices were. And then we came together as a community to say we really need to improve what we're doing, and they agreed to 5 principles. One of them was respecting human rights. We need to work in partnership. We need to do a better job on governance. And so that platform has really enabled us in the community and our colleagues to really reach out. And I don't know if anybody at the time realized they were getting into integration then, that they were really setting themselves up for it. But to me, that is a real turning point in conservation practice. And so I think what that has inspired is a new mindset in our country program leaders. Like the leader of our South Africa program definitely gets why we're working across all these different sectors and why we're really protecting those most vulnerable people and empowering them, both men and women. Gender equality is one of the outcomes of that Conservation Initiative on Human Rights that we seek. So I do think that has been one of the most positive developments in the conservation community. And then that trickles down to the community level, where we're really empowering these agents to be trained across a variety of sectors, because they're the ones who are carrying on the work for perpetuity and next generation. So,
Thank you. Other questions, comments? Yes.
Hello. I'm Sam Saliba. I'm the Urban Response Learning Manager at the International Rescue Committee. Before that, I was an integrated urban strategist in the private sector. So if you're curious as to what that means, you can come up and ask me later. But I focus more on humanitarian response in cities and the heightened importance of integration in cities. And so you mentioned working with CSOs. But also, I mean, there's no one really in this room, I don't think, that represents the government sector or the private sector, right? And when you talk about integration, it's also not integration within the expertise of one sector, be it the development or humanitarian sector, but also integration across anyone, and in cities, anyone who works within that specific place that you're operating in. From the private sector, academic, various government agencies that sometimes have very different mandates than your own, or enacting policies that go directly against what you're trying to combat, but yet still have local authority and mandate over the places that you're working in. So I'm just curious, from your experience, both in design and delivery, I think in delivery we often rely on local stakeholders, but not often in the design. So I'm particularly curious about that side of the equation. Just your experience working with various stakeholders and bringing them into the integration equation.
Great question. I think everybody will want a piece of that. Do you want me to start with you, Aerie?
Sure, I'll give it a go. We work entirely in a rural context, so not exact fit for the question, but I think taking it in terms of like an end-to-end design process of, you need to have a common end state, and all the stakeholders, for us it would be generally humanitarian aid or something like that. It isn't humanitarian aid ends and then development begins. They're intertwined, and sometimes you're going back and forth. And so making sure that you have that full spectrum in your design is key, because it's not, well, once this finishes, then I'm going to start this, and everything's going to be, kind of hunky-dory, because like you mentioned, the missions could be very different, or the policies could be very different. And so speaking early on before you actually start the intervention is key.
Cara? Everything that we do is and needs to be in line with the Ministry of Health, or the Ministry of Gender, Women, and Social Action, Ministry of Youth. Everything we do, we really need to be in line with that. And while we were implementing the community care program, we really started the referrals and counter referrals between projects. And through working with the government, we actually were able to develop a form. It's called the Guia de Referencia, and it's printed, and it was approved by the Ministry of Gender and Social Action to really formalize this structure of referring people to services that are outside your scope of work. So you'll say, here's a child that doesn't have access to education. I'm going to refer, here's a tick, and then having this counter referral where you know that child received the service. So that's been approved by the government, and because it's approved by the government, it really helps us to be able to implement it. So everything that we do does that.
yeah, I agree with what everyone else has said. In terms of where CI works, we're mostly working in the rural areas, not so much in the urban, but I do know lately we have implemented some projects, Water for Cities, where we're definitely looking at upstream conservation so that it benefits cities. And I think there's information on our website about that. I think it's in Mexico City, Rio, and Bogota. I'm not that familiar, but I could definitely get you some information on that. And the private sector question's very tricky. I myself don't have a lot of experience, but CI does have a whole Center for Environmental Leadership and Business, where we believe you have to engage businesses in order to change practices and make them more sustainable. And I do know that there are several corporate partners of ours who are interested in these integrated guidelines to see how they can implement them in and around the areas where they work as part of their corporate social responsibility and environmental safeguards. So I think there's some innovative thinking out there.
Can I just underscore your point about the private sector? I think to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, there'll need to be unprecedented collaboration between the public and private sectors, and that integration between the public and private sector is perhaps even more impactful than talking about within sectors as we are today. It's still highly controversial, as you know, and difficult for many of the public sector actors to work in partnership with the private sector, but unless we find ways to do that. And in my view as well, some of the best integration work is being done in the private sector. A lot of it here in the States by the technology companies. They are uncovering all sorts of value by integrating mobile phones and music. I mean, we know all the stories, we have all the devices. That's basically an integration agenda. So by partnering with the private sector and some of these great thinkers and actors for public benefit, I think we would all achieve our goals faster. But we have a lot more questions over here. I could see hands popping up. Yes, Ben.
I think one of the things about integrated development is it's a path which is going to be one you're going to be on a continual learning process. So, and you may never fully arrive at the end point. You can always get better at being more integrated. But you can imagine a spectrum where you've got where maybe most of the sector is right now, where the silos are completely disconnected. Then the next step is somewhere where you get the silos working more effectively together. From being completely disconnected, silos working together may be a step towards integration, and then you might get the kind of ultimate ambition, which would be genuine integration where things get woven together, and you can't tell the health and the education apart because they're actually the same thing. So I guess my question to all of you is, where do you see yourself on that spectrum? Where do you want to, and what are you going to do to improve how you do integrated development?
Let's start with Conservation International. Where are you on that spectrum, Ben, laid out?
I think we're probably somewhere in the middle. I think if we were to do like FHI 360 did, which kind of excites me, like an inventory of our projects, that would be unprecedented, first of all. And then we would probably find out there are a lot of integrated projects. We're probably somewhere in the middle. I think in order for us to maybe move a little bit more forward, we'd need a little bit more flexible funding from donors, and maybe not color coding the climate money and the biodiversity money and the health money, but to have more flexible frameworks. That might help us a little bit in that regard.
So in the middle?
In the middle.
Moving in the right direction?
Yeah.
Great.
I'm optimistic. Remember, I'm excited.
That's right. Aerie.
And what are you going to do to improve?
Well, I'm already a pretty loud voice, but I definitely think that my boss and other senior leadership at CI has to have a much more grounded understanding of how integrated development will help us improve our conservation outcomes. So continue to push on that advocacy agenda internally.
Just on that, before I turn to you, how many of you work for organisations where you think your top leadership actually gets integrated development? Could you just raise your hands if you feel you have a top leadership who totally get it? That's, what is that, about 30%? A little more, 40%? Greg, Greg, hand up. Okay, so not a majority, Aerie.
Sure. I'd say throughout Nuru's existence, we've sort of followed that progression that Ben laid out of first we designed individual programs that were stacked alongside each other and called it integration, and that they were co-located with the same population. And then we started dropping some programs and coupling others to see if that design process would work better. And now we've started designing programs together. I think just in my experience with it, the progress toward that full integration needs to come from designing everything together. When you start adding things on later, it just becomes more challenging because the parts, you're cobbling projects and programs together and funding together to make it work. And so We're not quite at that fully seamless integration of where you can't tell, everything's just Nuru at that stage or something, I don't know. But we're getting toward that. And so, yeah.
And what are you going to do to push it faster, farther?
I'd say it's more about just designing everything together.
Your leadership, what can you say? They're all watching you.
We're perfect. No, I think that being in the field office right now, we're, with different projects that are funded in siloed ways, we still are at that siloed level and then trying to put that integration together from there. But there's a lot you can do with that, and I think that you can be creative and you can work with what you have. Nothing's ever going to be perfect, so it's being able to take what you have and do what you can with it, and I think that we've been able to do some of that work. But what can we do, where can we go, how can we advocate for more integration? And I know we already talked about evidence a little bit, but we need that evidence to show that what we're doing is worth it, because working together, it takes time, it takes resources, it takes collaboration, it is a lot of effort. It's not just something that you can say, oh, here's a matrix we developed, now go do this. We have to work on the Maputo level, and then you're going to the field, and then you're working with the government, and so there's a lot of players involved. So getting that evidence and showing that what we did actually made a difference in the lives of the communities that we're serving will help. And getting to that impact, though, that is tricky. And I know we have some studies that Trish showed us earlier. But what is the ultimate impact of all of this integration?
So we do have time for some more questions. Yes.
Hi, I'm Mary Wynn Wigley. I work with the Integrated Development Team at FHI 360. And we hypothesize often that better, more meaningful, and earlier engagement with communities and with the people that we're working with will naturally result in more integrated programs, because people don't live their lives in silos, and we know that the determinants of quality of life are so interconnected, right? So my question is, given that, if you agree with that, is the call for integration really a call for more meaningful, earlier engagement with communities? And in addition to that, do we run the risk of an additional layering of silos if our integration decisions are top-down instead of actually coming from what communities need? In other words, we know that such and such sectors have evidence that when we put them together, there's added benefit or there's cost savings, but it's still coming from up here. And so I'd like to ask the panel, as we're talking about design and delivery, what you think about that, and how do we make our calls for integration also calls for really more meaningful, earlier engagement with communities and listening to their voices? Thanks.
We'll start with that, Janet.
Yeah,
Have a round of applause for that.
That is the crux of the issue, right? But it's not just earlier engagement with them, it's earlier ownership, right? They need to be the ones who are leading, right? And so I think you're right, the top down has been proven it's not working. Like, it's great we have our theories of change and we can get together around the root causes, like that's great, and that is helping build the evidence, but I think your point is taken that those community level actors are really where it's happening. And there is also another thing about those island nations I mentioned. So they have devolved or decentralized their budgeting when their democracies were working, at least. So they have really put those decisions for budgets at the lower level, and they tend to be multi-sectoral and integrated down there. So I do think that's another contributing factor, enabling factor that maybe we're not seeing in some other areas where we're trying to do integration. But I think you're right, getting it down is the best. The problem that we deal with in a lot of places, though, is corruption, right? And is that money really there, and is it getting to the people who need it the most? So.
Cara, and then Aerie.
I actually think that being in Maputo or being in Washington, D.C., we actually make everything a lot more complicated. When we talk about integration, we actually start at the districts. We start in the communities, because for some reason, yeah, for us, we think this is so hard to do and we have to make sure that all of this works. But if you bring this issue to the communities and you ask them, well, how are we going to do this? Things come out that I never would have even thought of. I'm like, oh yeah, that makes so sense. I didn't even think of that. So I actually think that we make things a lot more complicated. And there's a lot of integration going on in the field. There's a lot of integration without us even talking about it, it just happens. But what we're trying to do in Mozambique is really formalize that a little bit and start to track it a little bit and see what happens. We're starting to do a pilot in one of our communities, but the first thing that we're doing is going to the community and saying, okay, how are we going to do this? Because I don't think we have the answer.
I would agree with a lot of what the panel said. All of our projects, we design on the ground through a co-creation process. And so I think local leadership, local ownership, local agency are key factors, and it's inextricable from the design process because context is so important. You could have RCTs that this worked in this context with these implementers. You take it to a completely different context, it may not work, and you may not know why. I think that the local knowledge and kind of cross-pollinating ideas, if you can come in with some ideas and some perspective, but unless that local perspective is taken into consideration in that design process, you may have something that just doesn't fit, or you might be seeing it in your own silo of, this is the need that I'm looking for, and so I'm a hammer always looking for nails.
Yes, Tricia.
Hi, I'm Tricia. We've met. I work at FHI 360 on the integrated development team, and Wenny, who asked that last question, is actually my other half. So what I wanted to say was just adding on to the panelists and sort of to reinforce her comment and then your answers is, I think one of the things we brought up this morning is, why are we having this conversation now? Integrated development isn't new. I think, the implicit assumption in there is we're talking about integrated rural development that happened, a couple decades ago, and I think the probably widespread belief on why that didn't end up working out was that it was top down. So if we don't want to repeat history, I think that's a very cautionary tale for us to take very seriously, that type of integration didn't work because it was blueprint and it was top down. So we should really truly take that to heart and not do that again. I think we do need the evidence, and that is generated up here most of the time. But there are other types of evidence that I think do come from the community that we can take very seriously. And I would say I don't think we're totally there yet, but our team is really striving to make the general principles of doing development differently, the manifesto that came out a couple years ago, really the heart of what we do, because we think if you do those things, integration will naturally probably happen, and it's not the objective anyway, it's better development. So in the theory of change that we have out in the hallway, our very first precondition is what Wenny was saying, she's holding it up, is that development efforts, the goal is that development efforts are sufficiently responsive to the multifaceted nature of people's lives. And the way we outline that should happen is starting with communities. So getting over token engagement, actually truly doing it for once and walking the walk as a development community to do things differently, and then we think part of that will naturally lead to some integration. So I commend the folks on the stage because I know that you're out in the trenches and you're trying to make this happen, and it's not easy, but I think we should really challenge ourselves to do that for real.
Can I just add a personal story to that, a bit of a reality check? So the polio eradication effort is something that will be well known to everyone in this room, one of the largest siloed programs in development with a very ambitious goal, which will probably be achieved, huge achievement for the world. The polio eradication effort was visiting northern Nigeria, going into homes sometimes 6 times a year to give children in those homes their polio drops. And they were let into the home. It's a very sophisticated delivery vehicle. Of course, northern Nigeria is home to some of the world's most malnourished children, low levels of modern contraceptive use, children dying from other causes like pneumonia and diarrhea that are easily preventable and treatable. We approached the polio team to talk about integration. Several groups were approaching the polio team to talk about integration. And we made some progress with a lot of the evidence that FHI 360 was building at the time. At the same time, the families in northern Nigeria were begging the polio effort to do more than just come into their homes 4, 5, 6 times a year and give their child 1 drop. They said, where's the ORS and zinc? We want our children vaccinated for other reasons. Our children are starving. My husband just lost his job. I'm not allowed out of the home. I can't seek care, etc. This is my 6th pregnancy. Where is birth control? Why can't you do more? And there was a lack of understanding, which was totally rational on behalf of the local community, for why this effort couldn't do more. We failed to persuade the polio team, very powerful, well-funded group of organisations, to open up their platform to integration. And while polio will be eradicated, which is a huge achievement, I have to look back and say how much more could have been achieved for those children in northern Nigeria and everywhere else that program is working if we'd only been able to integrate the delivery channels. So we have a huge challenge ahead of us, but if we would only listen to the families who are calling for integration, and I'm hoping that's what we can all in this room agree to take away as a key message. If you build around people, integration is in the DNA of all of our programs and efforts. I want to thank very much Aerie, Janet and Cara today for their candid comments, for the good news and the bad news, and ask you to return to your seats, where you are also going to be